Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that the United States dollar, the most powerful currency in the history of human civilization, is no longer the language of global oil trade. Imagine a world where Saudi Arabia, the kingdom that has been America's most loyal energy partner for over 7 decades, is now conducting billion-dollar oil deals in Chinese yuan. Imagine the stock markets of New York, London, and Tokyo all crashing simultaneously, not because of a war, not because of a pandemic, but because two men, one in Riyadh and one in Beijing, sat across from each other and quietly made a decision that would redraw the entire map of global economic power. That morning is not a distant hypothetical. That morning is not science fiction. That morning is already being engineered in backroom meetings, in secret diplomatic cables, and in financial agreements that the mainstream media is barely covering. And by the end of this video, you will understand exactly how close we are to that moment, and why the rest of the world is dangerously, recklessly, and almost willfully unprepared for what is coming. Stay with us, because what we are about to show you is not speculation. It is strategy. It is documented. It is confirmed by institutions from the Wall Street Journal to Goldman Sachs to the International Monetary Fund. And it is already in motion. For decades, the world ran on a simple, unspoken agreement. Saudi Arabia sells oil. Saudi Arabia sells the tea oil exclusively in US dollars. The world needs oil to function. Therefore, the world needs US dollars to survive. Every country on earth, from Germany to India to Japan to Brazil, had to stockpile Americas, and currency just to keep their lights on, their factories running, their supply chains moving, and their populations fed. This system gave the United States so nothing no empire in history had ever possessed before, the ability to print money and export inflation to the rest of the world. Every time Washington needed to spend more on wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, on bank bailouts after 2008, and pandemic stimulus packages worth trillions of dollars, it simply instructed the Federal Reserve to create more dollars. And because the world needed those dollars to buy oil, the inflation stayed relatively manageable inside America, while quietly spreading across the globe, driving up prices in developing economies, weakening currencies from Turkey to Argentina to Nigeria, and wring wealth invisibly but relentlessly from the rest of the world to the United States. This is what economists call the Petrodollar system. And for 73 years, it was the invisible, untouchable iron foundation of American global dominance. But now, for the first time since that system was created in the final years of the Second World War, a crack has appeared in that foundation. A crack that is widening with every passing month. A crack that neither American diplomacy nor American military power has found a way to close. And the man holding the hammer is named Mohammed bin Salman. And standing silently beside him, with the patient confidence of someone who has been waiting a very long time for this moment, is Xi Jinping. To understand how we got here, we need to go back to the very beginning. We need to understand the original deal in full. In February of 1945, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, returning from the Yalta Conference, met with King Abdulaziz ibn Saud aboard a U.S. Navy destroyer escort called the USS Quincy, anchored in the Bitter Lakes section of the Suez Canal. It was a meeting between two men who represented radically different worlds. One, a wheelchair-bound democratic leader from a country that had just become the undisputed dominant power on Earth. The other, a Bedouin king who had unified the tribes of the Arabian Peninsula through decades of warfare and diplomacy, and who controlled sitting above the largest known oil reserves on the planet. What happened in that meeting was never fully made public. There was no formal written treaty, no publicly ratified agreement, but the outcome was absolutely clear in every action that followed. The United States would guarantee the security of the Saudi royal family, protect the kingdom from all external threats, supply Saudi Arabia with weapons, military technology, and unconditional political support in international forums. In exchange, Saudi Arabia would sell its oil exclusively in US dollars, would not align with any power hostile to the United States, and would invest its surplus oil revenues, which came to be called petrodollars, back into American treasury bonds and financial institutions, recycling wealth back into the American economy. It was a perfect circular system, a perpetual motion machine of global financial power. America printed dollars. Saudi Arabia sold oil for those dollars. Countries around the world bought those dollars to pay for that DOI. Saudi Arabia then bought American government debt with the dollars it accumulated. America used that borrowed money to fund its enormous military apparatus. And that MI-literary apparatus protected Saudi Arabia from every threat, from Soviet influence during the Cold War, from Iraqi aggression in 1990, from Iranian revolutionary ambitions, from internal and external challenges to the rule of the House of Saud. Round and round it went, decade after decade, war after war, crisis after crisis. This deal survived every earthquake in global politics for 3/4 of a century. It survived the 1973 oil embargo, when Arab nations cut off oil supplies to punish America for its support of Israel in the Yom Kippur War, causing gasoline shortages and economic chaos across the Western world. It survived the Iranian Revolution of 1979, which fundamentally altered the regional balance of power and created Saudi Arabia's most dangerous and enduring rival. It survived the Gulf War of 1990 and 1991, when American forces were stationed on Saudi soil, a deployment that caused profound domestic controversy inside the kingdom, but that the royal family ultimately accepted as the price of protection. It survived the September 11th attacks in 2001, even though 15 of the 19 hijackers were Saudi nationals, and even though investigations later suggested financial and institutional connections to Saudis. Arabia that American officials spent years downplaying. It even survived the murder of Washington Post journalist and Saudi dissident Jamal Khashoggi inside the Saudi consulate in Istanbul in October 2018, an event that caused global revulsion that intelligence agencies attributed directly to a Saudi government operation authorized at the highest levels, and that resulted in enormous international pressure on the kingdom. But ultimately, after some temporary awkwardness, no lasting consequences for the fundamental US-Saudi relationship. The petrodollar survived everything, until now. Until the calculation in Riyadh changed in a way that no American strategist had adequately prepared for, because something fundamentally changed when Mohammed bin Salman formally consolidated his power in 2017 by outmaneuvering, arresting, and sidelining virtually every other armed member of the Saudi royal family who might have challenged him. In the space of a single weekend, in what was called an anti-corruption crackdown, but was more accurately described as a palace coup, MBS detained hundreds of princes, ministers, and businessmen in the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in Riyadh, and did not release them until the EY had signed over assets and agreed to terms he dictated. It was breathtaking in its audacity. And it announced to the world unambiguously that Saudi Arabia had a new kind of leader, not a sea-cautious consensus builder in the mold of his predecessors, but a bold, impatient, risk-tolerant visionary who was willing to break every convention to achieve his goals. Vision 2030 was the public face of this new leadership. Presented to the world as a domestic economic reform program, a blueprint to diversify Saudi Arabia away from its overwhelming dependence on oil revenue and build a modern, technology-driven, globally competitive economy, it was sold through slick international presentations, high-profile consulting engagements with Mekike Insei and other Western firms, and a sustained media campaign designed to rebrand Saudi Arabia as a progressive, forward-thinking nation opening itself to the world. The entertainment sector was liberalized. Women were allowed to drive. Cinemas reopened for the first time in decades. International sporting events were imported with enormous financial incentives. Neom, a futuristic city in the desert that would be built entirely from scratch and would use artificial intelligence to manage every aspect of urban life, was, Anowan said, with grandiose ambition. All of these things are real programs. All of them are being pursued with genuine resources and genuine commitment. But Vision 2030 has another dimension. A deeper, less publicized, but arguably more consequential dimension. A geopolitical dimension that is openly discussed in Chinese, Russian, and Gulf state policy documents, acknowledged in academic research from institutions across Asia and the Middle East, but that receives almost no sustained attention in mainstream Western media. And that dimension is this. Saudi Arabia is quietly, systematically, and deliberately constructing an alternative to its dependence on the United States, not just economically, not just militarily, but monetarily. At the deepest architectural level of the global financial system, here is where the story becomes truly extraordinary. Here is where we stop talking about entertainment venues and technology investments and start talking about the foundations of global power. But to understand why any of this matters, we first need to understand something fundamental about China. China is the largest importer of crude oil on planet Earth. In 2023, China imported approximately 11 million barrels of oil every single day. That number is almost incomprehensible in its scale. It is more oil than the entire consumption of most continents. It represents the lifeblood of the second largest economy in human history, the fuel for factories that produce the goods the entire world consumes, the energy source for a grid that powers over 1 billion people's daily lives, the raw material for a petrochemical industry that produces everything from plastics to pharmaceuticals. And for the past several decades, China has paid to purchase every single barrel of that oil in US dollars, just like everyone else. This means that China, a nation with its own currency that it manages with extraordinary care, with its own central bank, with its own military ambitions, with an explicit goal of displacing the United States as the world's leading power, has been forced to maintain enormous reserves of American currency simply to keep its economy functioning from one day to the next. Beijing finds this situation strategically intolerable, and more than intolerable, dangerous. Because if America ever decided to weaponize the dollar against China, something that would have seemed impossible a decade ago, but that became a live policy conversation after the Ukraine sanctions of 2022, China could theoretically face economic strangulation without a single shot being fired. The United States could designate Chinese financial institutions, freeze Chinese dollar assets, cut China off from SWIFT, and impose an economic siege of devastating effect. The dollar gives Washington a kill switch over the Chinese economy. And that kill switch is the single greatest strategic vulnerability in China's entire national security architecture. Xi Jinping watched what happened to Russia after the Ukraine invasion with intense, focused attention. He watched as American-led sanctions froze approximately $300 billion of Russian foreign currency reserves overnight, reserves that Russia accumulated over decades and considered fully sovereign. He watched as Russia was expelled from the SWIFT banking system, cutting off its bank's FFRM international transactions. He watched as the ruble collapsed, as Western companies fled, as the Russian economy faced unprecedented pressure. And he drew from that experience a conclusion that has become the central organizing principle of Chinese financial strategy. China would not allow itself to be in that position. China would need its own financial architecture, an architecture that could not be weaponized by Washington, an architecture that the United States could not switch off with a policy decision. And the single most important key to that architecture was not a Chinese bank, not a Chinese technology company, not a Chinese military asset. It was Saudi Arabia. This is the foundational insight behind the Beijing Riyadh Axis. China needed an energy anchor for its alternative financial system, and Saudi Arabia was the only country on earth that could serve that function. Saudi Aramco is not just the world's most profitable company. It is the world's most geopolitically signified company. Its production decisions affect global oil prices. Its export relationships shape the economic fortunes of entire nations. Its pricing currency determines what the world's most essential commodity is denominated in. If Saudi Arabia prices oil in yuan, even a fraction of it, the yuan becomes energy-backed. And energy-backed currencies have a credibility that no amount of diplomatic maneuvering can manufacture. You cannot sanction energy. You cannot decree that the world does not need oil. The physical reality of global energy dependence provides a backing for any currency used to denominate it. The mechanics of how this axis formed began accelerating visibly around 2022 and 2023, though the groundwork had been laid over years of quieter diplomatic engagement. In March of 2023, Saudi Arabia made an announcement that should have dominated every financial news headline in the world for weeks. The kingdom officially stated that it was open to settling oil trades in currencies other than the US dollar. The statement was carefully worded. It was framed with diplomatic hedging. It included as assurances that Saudi Arabia was not abandoning its relationship with Washington. But the substance was unmistakable to anyone with a serious understanding of international monetary economics. The foundational premise of the petrodollar system, that Saudi oil is always and only sold in US dollars, had been publicly renounced. For the first time in 7 decades, the kingdom that created and sustained the petrodollar was saying, the old arrangement is negotiable, and the infrastructure to replace it was already being built. China had spent years constructing the Shanghai Petroleum and Natural Gas Exchange, a commodity trading platform specifically designed to allow oil and gas to be bought and sold in Chinese yuan. This was not a startup project. It was a state-directed strategic entity. Now we need to pause and fully reckon with what the economic stakes actually are here. Because this is the part that every investor, every business owner, every person with a pension or a savings account or a mortgage needs to understand with absolute clarity. The dollar's status as the global reserve currency, the currency that all other currencies are ultimately measured against, the currency all central banks hold as their primary foreign exchange reserves, the currency in which the vast majority of global commodity trade is denominated. Is not just a financial technicality that affects bankers and economists. It is the source of what French President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing memorably called America's exorbitant privilege. And that privilege is the invisible subsidy that the entire rest of the world provides to the United States economy every single day. Because the world needs dollars, America can borrow at uniquely low interest rates. Foreign governments and institutions will always buy American Treasury bonds because they need to hold dollar assets. This demand keeps U.S. borrowing costs lower than any economic fundamentals would otherwise justify. Because the world needs dollars, America's CN run enormous trade deficits. buying far more from the rest of the world than it sells, without triggering the currency collapse and inflation spiral that would immediately devastate any other coup and try attempting the same thing. Because the world needs dollars, America has the extraordinary power to impose economically rippling sanctions on any country, any institution, any individual, simply by cutting off their access to the dollar system. The dollar is not just a means of payment. It is a geopolitical weaponization on which American global power projection is built, maintained, and financed. And now, for the first time in the post-war era, that foundation is being systematically, deliberately, and successfully undermined. Not by military force, not by a nuclear threat, but by commerce, by trade agreements, by the ancient construction of parallel financial infrastructure in the marble-floored palaces of Riyadh and the state planning rooms of Beijing. Consider the concrete numbers. Goldman Sachs estimated in 2023 that the dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves had already declined from approximately 70% in 2000 to below 60%. That is a decline of 10 percentage points over 2 decades in a system that was supposed to be immovably stable. The trend is not accelerating, but it is consistent. And the structural drivers behind it, the weaponization of dollar sanctions, the rise of alternative settlement systems, the deliberate diversification strategies of countries like China, Russia, India, and the Gulf states, are not going away. They are becoming more pronounced with every passing year. Every time America uses the dollar weapon aggressively, it gives more countries more incentive to reduce their exposure to the dollar system. The sanctions tool is being overused in a way that is gradually destroying the conditions that make it effective. And the consequences of further dollar erosion are not abstract. If even 20% of global oil trade migrates away from dollar denomination, the demand for US dollars in foreign exchange markets falls sharply. Countries no longer need to hold as many dollar reserves. They begin diversifying their foreign exchange holdings into yuan, into euros, into gold, into a basket of currency S. The value of the dollar relative to other currencies declines. To attract foreign buyers of U.S. Treasury bonds in that environment, American interest rates to U.S. rise, because foreign investors demand a higher return to compensate for the reduced safety of holding dollar assets. Rising interest rates mean rising costs for the U.S. government to service its now $33 trillion national debt. Rising interest costs mean either higher taxes, lower government spending, or more borrowing, each of which carries its own severe political and economic consequences. The cycle becomes self-reinforcing. Dollar weakness leads to higher borrowing costs. Higher borrowing costs strain the federal budget. Budget strain reduces confidence in America, in fiscal management. Reduced confidence further weakens the dollar's attractiveness as a reserve asset. This is the spiral that every serious economist at the Federal Reserve and the Treasury Department is already modeling in private, even if they rarely discuss it publicly. Now let us move to the military and security dimension of what is happening. Because the economic story, extraordinary as it is, represents only half of the full picture. The other half, the half that determines whether the economic transition can actually be completed or whether it will be disrupted by conflict before it reaches its destination, is about security architecture, about military relations hips, about who will protect Saudi Arabia in a world where the American security guarantee can no longer be taken for granted. MBS is not operating under any illusions about the risks of his pivot. He understands that the United States has military bases throughout the Gulf region. He knows that the U.S. Fifth Fleet is stationed in Bahrain, just across a narrow causeway from Saudi Arabia's eastern oil fields. He knows that thousands of American troops remain deployed in Saudi Arabia, in neighboring Kuwait and Qatar. He knows that the most advanced weapon systems in the Saudi military inventory, its F-15 fighter jets, its Patriot missile defense batteries, its precision-guided munitions, its naval vessels, were supplied by American defense companies under contracts that include long-term maintenance and support arrangement, NTS. If Washington chose to respond to Saudi Arabia's monetary pivot with a severe restriction on arms sales or withdrawal of military cooperation, the consequences for Saudi security would be immediate and serious. MBS knows all of this, and he has been building his hedges for years. Saudi Arabia has been quietly diversifying its weapons acquisition relations hips, opening procurement discussions with Chinese defense manufacturers, placing orders with European suppliers, including French and British companies, and evaluating Russian military systems in areas where American technology is either unavailable or comes with political conditions attached. The goal is not to replace American weapons overnight. That would be impossible in any realistic time frame. The goal is to reduce the leverage that Washington holds over Riyadh through arms dependency, to ensure that any American decision to restrict weapons sales carries a manageable rather than catastrophic security cost for the kingdom. But even more significant than weapons procurement is what China brokered in March of 2023 in what may be the single most consequential diplomatic achievement of the 21st century thus far. In a development that received enormous media coverage for approximately 1 week and has since been substantially underanalyzed in its strategic implications, China mediated a formal diplomatic normalization between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Two CEU entries that had been bitter regional rivals for decades, two countries that had severed all diplomatic relations in 2016 after the Saudi government's executio of a prominent Shia cleric had triggered violent protests in Iran that attacked Saudi diplomatic missions. Two countries that had been engaged in devastating proxy wars across the Middle East, in Yemen, where a Saudi-led coalition fought against Iranian-backed Houthi rebels, in Iraq, where Iranian-backed militias competed with Saudi-aligned political for CES, in Lebanon, where Hezbollah's Iranian patronage brought it into constant tension with Saudi-supported political factions, in Syria, where Saudi and Iranian interests backed opposing sides of a catastrophic civil war. For 7 years of severed relations and escalating proxy confrontation, the Saudi-Iran rivalry had been the defining fault line of Middle Eastern geopolitics. And then China fixed it. Or more precisely, China created the conditions under which both sides found it in their interest to fix it. Beijing invited Saudi and Iranian representatives to negotiations in China, provided the diplomatic cover and institutional framework for the talks, and emerged with a signed agreement that both sides presented to their domestic audiences as a diplomatic victory. The symbolic weight of this achievement cannot be overstated. The United States had been the indispensable mediator of Middle Eastern geopolitics since the Camp David Accords of 1978. American presidents had invested enormous political capital trying to manage regional tensions, broker peace deals, and prevent the Saudi-Iran rivalry from exploding into open conflict. American diplomatic resources had been consumed for decades by the management of a relationship that China resolved, or at least established a framework for resolving, in a matter of months of focused diplomacy. China announced to the world that it was no longer content to be merely an economic presence in the Middle East. It was now a security actor, a diplomatic power broker, a geopolitical force capable of reshaping regional order in ways that had previously been exclusively within the American sphere of influence. For Washington, this was a strategic shock of the first order, not because the Saudi-Iran normalization was itself a threat to American interests. In fact, reduced regional tensions are generally consistent with American goals, but because of what it demonstrated about the shifting geography of influence. A power that America had spent decades treating primarily as an economic rival had demonstrated an ability to project diplomatic and strategic influence into a region that Washington had long treated as its exclusive domain. And it had done so not through military force or economic coercion, but through the patient, persistent application of diplomatic capital and economic incentives. It was exactly the kind of soft power maneuver that China had been studying and perfecting for decades, and it worked. The implications for the Strait of Hormuz are the most immediately consequential for the global economy. This narrow waterway, 18 miles wide at its choke point, flanked by Iran on the northern shore and the Musandam Peninsula of Oman on the southern, carries approximately 17 to 20 million barrels of oil every single day. Saudi crude, Emirati crude, Kuwaiti crude, Iraqi oil, Qatari liquefied natural gas destined for markets in Asia and Europe. All of it must pass through those 18 miles to reach the open ocean and the global market. The Strait of Hormuz is the most critical energy choke point on Earth. Nothing else comes close in terms of the volume of global energy supply that flows through a single physical geography. Iran has understood this strategic reality for decades and has repeatedly demonstrated its willingness to use the threat of Hormuz disruption as leverage in its confrontations with Western powers. The threat is credible. Iran possesses anti-ship missiles capable of threatening tanker traffic. It has naval and Revolutionary Guard forces deployed throughout the Gulf. It has demonstrated, through the seizure of tankers in 2019 and attacks on oil infrastructure in Saudi Arabia and the UAE, that it is willing to take aggressive actions in the Gulf when it believes its core interests are threatened. Every spike in Iran-related geopolitical tension over the past 2 decades has been accompanied by an immediate spike in global oil prices, because oil markets understand that the physical vulnerability of Hormuz is real. But here's the strategic logic that the Beijing Riyadh Axis has quietly altered. China has become the single largest customer for Iranian oil, defying American sanctions, purchasing Iranian crude through a network of intermediaries and financial arrangements designed to obscure the transactions. China provides Iran with an economic lifeline that is worth tens of billions of dollars annually, and without which the Iranian government's fiscal position would be far more precarious. Iran is dependent on Chinese demand, and China, having now invested its diplomatic credibility in the Saudi-Iran normalization, has a direct interest in ensuring that Iran does not take actions that destabilize the GULF, or threaten the oil flows that China itself depends upon. Beijing has, in effect, acquired a degree of influence over Iranian decision-making in the Gulf that no American administration has ever possessed. China cannot order Iran to do anything, but it can make very clear the rough economic incentives and disincentives, what actions it finds acceptable and unacceptable. And a China-friendly Iran is a considerably less trigger-happy Iran, at least with respect to the Strait of Hormuz. This is the deeper geometry that makes the Beijing Riyadh Axis something more than a bilateral economic arrangement. It is an interconnected web of relationships, China at the center, Saudi Arabia and Iran as the two great regional powers being monarchiaed and incentivized simultaneously, the UAE and Kuwait and Qatar orbiting the arrangement as smaller nodes, Russia providing energy and military technology as a secondary partner. C. China has positioned itself as the indispensable economic and diplomatic actor for every major player in the Gulf simultaneously. This is not an alliance in the traditional Western sense. It is something more subtle and, in some ways, more powerful. A network of bilateral dependencies, all flowing through Beijing, that gives China leverage over the entire regional order without the costs and commitments that formal alliances entail. And this brings us to the most extraordinary detail in the entire story. The revelation that we have been building toward since the first words of this video. The element of the Beijing Riyadh axis that explains why we use the word secret in our title. This is the piece of the puzzle that transforms everything that has come before from an interesting geopolitical realignment into a potentially world historical monetary revolution. The discussion, documented in reporting from the Wall Street, Journal, Bloomberg, and financial analysts at major investment banks, concerns gold. Not gold as jewelry or as an industrial metal. Gold as money. Specifically, the discussion centers on whether Saudi Arabia's oil sales to China, conducted in yuan, could include the option for Saudi Arabia to convert those yuan into gold through the Shanghai Gold Exchange. The mechanism would work as follows. China pays for Saudi oil in yuan. Saudi Arabia, rather than being forced to hold yuan, a currency it cannot fully trust, because it is managed by a foreign government and subject to Chinese capital controls, has the right to exchange those yuan for a defined quantity of physical gold, stored and transacted through the Shanghai Exchange. If this arrangement were formalized and implemented at meaningful scale, the implications would be seismic, because it would mean that Saudi oil is not simply being repriced from dollars into yuan, it is being repriced into something even more fundamental, a yuan that is partially backed by gold convertibility. In other words, China would be offering Saudi Arabia a monetary arrangement that shares certain structural characteristics with the original Bretton Woods system, in which the dollar was convertible, tiable into gold at a fixed rate, but with the roles reversed. Instead of America offering dollar gold convertibility to the world, China would be offering yuan gold convertibility to the world's most critical oil exporter. This is not a theoretical curiosity. This is the potential architecture of a new monetary order. Gold, unlike yuan, unlike dollars, unlike euros, is no government's liability. It cannot be printed. It cannot be sanctioned. It cannot be frozen in a foreign central bank by executive order. It cannot be inflated away by a decision of any monetary authority. Gold is the one monetary asset that exists genuinely outside the control of any sovereign government nut. A Saudi Arabia that accepts yuan for oil but converts yuan into gold has effectively created an oil for gold arrangement, the most credibly independent monetary relationship any oil exporter has ever had with its largest customer. And if this arrangement works for Saudi Arabia and China, the precedent it sets is revolutionary. Other oil exporters, Iraq, the UAE, Kuwait, Angola, Venezuela, would face immediate pressure from their Chinese trading partners to accept similar arrangements. Other major commodity exporters, copper producers in Chile and Congo, iron ore exporters in Australia and Brazil, agricultural exporters across Southeast Asia, would evaluate whether yuan for commodity for gold arrangements made sense for them too. The architecture would spread. And as it spread, the demand for gold as the ultimate settlement asset in a multipolar world would increase dramatically. The demand for the US dollar as the world's essential reserve currency would correspondingly decline. This is, in essence, what a post-petrodollar world looks like. Not a world where oil is priced in yuan in the same way it was once priced in dollars, with yuan achieving the same unchallengeable hegemony that the dollar once held, but a world of genuine monetary pluralism, anchored ultimately in gold as the neutral settlement asset, where no single nation's currency holds the structural advantages that the dollar has held since 1945. A world in which America's exorbitant privilege no longer exists. A world in which the United States mu saint balance its budget like every other country. borrow at market rates like every other government, and conduct its foreign policy without the financial weapon of dollar dominance at its disposal. Now, we must be completely honest with you about the uncertainties. Geopolitics is not deterministic. The most powerful forces in history have been redirected by unexpected events, by the decisions of individuals, by accidents and coincidences that no analyst predicted. The petrodollar system, HEYES, survived profound shocks before. It has survived challenges that seemed at the time to be existential. The United States retains formidable tools for slowing, disrupting, or reversing the process we have described. American diplomacy, when focused with genuine strategic intent, has repeatedly demonstrated an ability to shift the calculations of even determined adversaries. American financial institutions remain the most sophisticated and deeply embedded in global markets of any countries. The U.S. military remains without peer in its power projection capabilities, and Saudi Arabia remains deeply integrated into an American-centered security architecture that cannot be replaced overnight or without enormous risk. There are also significant structural obstacles on the Chinese side of this equation. The yuan is not freely convertible. China maintains strict capital controls, government restrictions on the movement of money into and out of the country that are fundamentally incompatible with the role of a true global reserve currency. A currency that cannot be freely moved across borders, cannot serve as the universal medium of exchange that the dollar currently provides. For the yuan to genuinely challenge the dollar's reserve status, China will need to open its capital account, to allow markets rather than Communist Party officials to determine the allocation and value of its currency. And that is something Beijing HEYES consistently refused to do, because it would introduce a degree of financial volatility and reduce a degree of governmental control that the party finds politically threatening. This tension between China's monetary ambitions and its political constraints is real and cannot be wished away. Furthermore, the Saudi-Iran normalization, while historically significant in its symbolism, is structurally fragile. The deep tensions between the two countries of sectarian, ideological, territorial, historical, have not been resolved. They have been temporarily managed, and managed relationships can unravel quickly when circumstances change, when domestic politics in either country shift, or when a new regional crisis creates incentives for confrontation rather than accommodation. China's influence over Iranian behavior is real but limited. Beijing can incentivize, it cannot control. So the picture is one of profound uncertainty combined with unmistakable directional momentum. The old certainties are dissolving. The foundations of the post-war financial architecture are shifting beneath our feet. The world is in a period of structural transition whose ultimate destination is not yet determined. And in that period of transition, the decisions made by a handful of individuals, in Riyadh and Beijing primarily, but also in Washington, in Tehran, in Moscow, in New Delhi, in Brussels, he'll determine whether that transition is managed peacefully and successfully, or whether it triggers the kind of geopolitical and economic crisis that historically accompanies the transition of monetary hegemony from one power to another. History is not comforting on this point. The last great transition of global monetary hegemony, from TI British pound to the US dollar in the first half of the 20th century, was accompanied by two world wars, a global depression that lasted a decade, and the near-complete collapse of the international trading system. The transition was not caused by those catastrophes, but it was deeply intertwined with them. The instability of the interwar monetary system, the breakdown of the gold standard, the competitive devaluations, the Tariff wars, amplified every other source of conflict and made the global system far more fragile and far more prone to cascading failure than it would otherwise have been. When the monetary architecture of the world is in transition, every other source of instability becomes more dangerous. We are in that transition now, and the Beijing Riyadh Axis is its most visible expression. Mohammed bin Salman is 38 years old. He is likely to rule Saudi Arabia for the next 4 or 5 decades. He is the longest horizon thinker in the in any geopolitical discussion involving his country. He does not think in terms of election cycles or quarterly financial results. He thinks in terms of generations. And when he looks across the sweep of historical time, what he sees is a United States whose structural economic and political challenges are real and deepening, and a China whose ancient, consistent accumulation of economic and technological power represents the defining trend of the 21st century. He is not betting against America. He is betting on a multipolar world in which Saudi Arabia is indispensable to every major power simultaneously, to America for its security relationships and technology access, to China for its energy exports and financial architecture, to the broader global south as a financial anchor and diplomatic bridge. He is betting that in a multipolar world, a truly independent Saudi Arabia is worth more than a subordinate Saudi Arabia. And he is using the most powerful tool at his disposal, control over the world's most critical energy reserves, to make that bet pay off. The geography of the Beijing Riyadh Axis is ultimately not about physical territory. It is about the invisible infrastructure of global financial power, the currency systems and commodity exchanges and reserve arrangements and gold vaults that determine more than any army or any treaty who holds the real levers of global influence. It is a geography being redrawn not by tanks and missiles, but by trade agreements and currency swaps and QUIET conversations in royal palaces and Communist Party conference rooms. It is a geography that most people in the West are not watching careful why enough. And it is a geography that, by the time it becomes impossible to ignore, will have already largely determined the shape of the world we live in. The question that should be keeping every serious policymaker, every investor, every student of history awake at night is not whether this transition is happening. It is. The question is how it ends, whether the old powers and the new ones find a way to share the stage of global economic governance without catastrophic conflict. Whether the United States accepts the erosion of its exorbitant privilege gradually and adapts its economy and its foreign policy accordingly. Whether China's Monet, our ambitions, can be accommodated within a reformed international financial system, rather than pursued through the construction of a parallel one that creates permanent structural rivalry. Whether Saudi Arabia's remarkable balancing act, playing both superpowers simultaneously, extracting maximum benefit from each, subordinating itself to neither, can be sustained without eventually forcing a choice that MBS has so far successfully avoided making. These are the questions that the Beijing Riyadh Axis poses to the world. They are questions without clean answers. They are questions that will define the next several decades of human history. And they deserve far more attention, far more serious analysis, and far more honest public discussion than they are currently receiving. The mainstream media will cover the next military confrontation in the Middle East. It will cover the next stock market crash, the next energy price spike, the next election in a major democracy. But it will consistently undercover the slow, structural, foundational transformation that is happening beneath all of those surface events. The transformation of the monetary architect, transformation that the Beijing Riyadh Axis represents. Now you understand it. Now you see the geography that most people cannot see. The geography of a new world being built in the desert heat of Riyadh and the deliberate patience of Beijing. A world in which the dollar's reign is not ending with a bang, but with the quio, T-scratch of a pen on a yuan-denominated oil contract. A world in which the most consequential revolution of our era is happening not on a battlefield, but in a commodity exchange. A world in which the map of power looks very different from the one we inherited. And a world that is arriving faster than almost anyone in a position of responsibility is prepared to acknowledge. If this analysis gave you a clearer picture of what is actually happening at the foundations of global power, share it with someone who needs to understand it. Because the more people who understand this transition clearly, the more pressure there will be on the institutions and the leaders who are responsible for MA, negging it to do so with the seriousness and the strategic vision it demands. Stay informed, stay analytical, and we will see you in the next one. Let us go even deeper into what the financial markets are already signaling about this transition, because the evidence is not hidden. It is sitting in plain sight in the data that institutional investors track every single day. Even if the narrative connecting those data points is rarely articulated clearly in public, gold prices have surged to historic highs over the past 3 years, repeatedly breaking records that stood for decades. The conventional explanation offered by financial commentators is that gold is rising because of inflation fears or because of geopolitical uncertainty in a general sense. Both of those explanations contain truth, but they are incomplete. The deeper explanation is that institutional actors, central banks, sovereign wealth funds, major commodity trading houses, are quietly repositioning for a world in which the dollar's dominance is structural, lie diminished. Central banks globally, and particularly central banks in the global south, have been buying gold at the fastest pace recorded in decades. People's Bank of China has been consistently adding to its gold reserves, though analysts widely believe its disclosed holdings significantly understate its actual accumulation. The centi, banks of Poland, Hungary, India, Turkey, and numerous other nations have been aggressively repatriating gold from storage in Western financial centers and adding to domestic holdings. This is not panic buying. It is strategic repositioning. It is the behavior of institutions that have concluded, based on their own analysis of the structural shifts in global finance, that the era OF unconditional dollar dominance is entering its terminal phase. and that gold will serve as the primary neutral reserve asset in whatever monetary order emerges on the other side. The sovereign wealth funds of the Gulf states tell a similar story. Saudi Arabia's public investment fund, the sovereign wealth fund that MBS personally controls and has designated as the primary financial engine of Vision 2030, has been dramatically diversifying away from U.S. Treasury holdings and into equities, alternative A assets, technology investments, and real assets across Asia and the global south. The UAE's Abu Dhabi Investment Authority, one of the world's largest sovereign wealth funds, has followed a similar trajectory. These are not small adjustments at the margin. They represent a fundamental reassessment of the RISK adjusted attractiveness of dollar-denominated assets by some of the most sophisticated institutional investors on Earth. When the countries that built the petrodollar system are reducing their holdings of the assets that system was designed to produce, the message is unmistakable. And what about the ordinary investor? What about the person watching this video who has a retirement account? A mortgage, a business, a family that depends on the stability of the global financial system? What should they be thinking about in light of everything we have discussed? The honest answer is that the transition we are describing, if it proceeds at its current pace and is managed without catastrophic disruption, is a slow-moving process that will unfold over years and decades rather than months. The dollar will not be dethroned by a single announcement or a single event. The petrodollar system will not end on a specific date that anyone can circle on a calendar today. What will happen is a gradual, grinding erosion of the dollar's structural advantages, the kind of erosion that makes the economy feel subtly more difficult over time without a single identifiable cause. Higher borrowing costs, more persistent inflation, a U.S. government that has less fiscal flexibility than it once had, American foreign policy that is constrained in ways that feel frustrating and inexplicable unless you understand the monetary foundations being eroded beneath it. But the risk of a disorderly, rapid transition, a sudden loss of confidence in the dollar triggered by some combination of geopolitical shock, fiscal crisis, and monetary miscalculation, is real and is growing. The variables that could accelerate the timeline dramatically include a major military confrontation involving China or Iran that disrupts Gulf oil supplies and forces emergency financial realignments. They include a domestic American fiscal crisis triggered by the unsustainable trajectory of government debt that forces the Federal Reserve to choose between protecting the dollar's value and protecting the economy from recession. They include a technological development, a widely adopted digital currency infrastructure, for instance, that makes yuan-denominated settlements as frictionless as dollar settlements, that removes one of the key practical obstacles to dollar displacement. None of these scenarios is inevitable. All of them are possible. And the convergence of multiple pressures simultaneously, which is exactly the kind of complex, multivariable crisis that financial systems historically fail to anticipate, is the scenario that should concern policymakers most urgently. Here is something else that is rarely discussed, but that is critically important for understanding why the Beijing Riyadh Axis is so strategically significant. Saudi Arabia does not just sell oil to China. Saudi Arabia is the swing producer for the entire global oil market. When Saudi Arabia decides to cut production, global oil prices rise. When it decides to increase production, prices fall. This power, the power to regulate the global price of the world's most essential commodity, is exercised through Saudi Arabia's role as the de facto leader of OPEC, the organization of the petroleum exporting countries, and its extended version OPEC+, which includes Russia and other major producers. OPE, C+ controls approximately 40% of global oil production and an even larger share of the world's proven oil reserves. In October of 2022, in a decision that caused enormous tension between Washington and Riyadh, OPEC+ announced a production cut of 2 million barrels per day. This was not a small technical adjustment. This was a deliberate, strategic decision that raised global oil prices at a moment when the Biden administration was desperately trying to keep energy prices down in the lead up to midterm elections and was publicly pressuring Saudi Arabia to increase production. The White House's fury was visible and barely disguised. American officials suggest that the kingdom's decision was tantamount to taking Russia's side in the Ukraine conflict. American politicians called for reevaluating the U.S.-Saudi relationship. Saudi officials, for their art, responded with remarkable calm and firmness. They said that the production decision was taken purely on economic grounds, in the interests of market stability, and that they did not take instructions from Washington on matters of economic policy. That exchange was a watershed moment. For the first time in decades, Saudi Arabia publicly and explicitly refused a direct American request on a core economic matter, and faced no meaningful consequences for doing so. The production cuts held. Oil prices rose. Saudi revenues increased. American pressure was absorbed without any structural change in the kingdom's posture, and the message transmitted to every capital in the world was clear. Saudi Arabia has achieved sufficient independence from American pressure that it can say no to Washington on matters that directly affect American political interests. That is a new and historically significant development. The ability to say no to Washington is itself a form of power that Saudi Arabia has never previously exercised so openly, and it is a power that the Beijing Riyadh Axis has directly enabled. BEC, as the more China becomes Saudi Arabia's largest customer, the largest investor in its economic diversification, and the diplomatic patron of its regional security arrangements, the less leverage Washington holds over Riyadh's decisions. Every percentage point of Saudi oil exports that flows to China, rather than Bahrain, and to Western markets reduces Washington's coercive leverage over Saudi decision-making. MBS understands this arithmetic precisely, and he has been managing it with the careful precision of a geopolitical chess master. We are now standing at a moment in history where the trends that we have described, the monetary shift, the diplomatic realignment, the security diversification, the gold conversation, are converging in ways that are creating genuine strategic uncertainty at the highest levels of every major government. And the most important thing to understand about this moment is that it is still in motion. The outcome is not determined. The Beijing Riyadh Axis is a powerful force reshaping the global order, but powerful forces can be redirected, countered, and sometimes reversed by other powerful forces. The United States still has the tools, the relationships, and the institutional capacity to respond effectively to this challenge if it chooses to do so with strategic clarity and sustained commitment. The question is whether American political culture, fractured, short-term focused, and increasingly consumed by domestic conflict, can summon the kind of long-horizon strategic thinking that this moment demands. That question is ultimately not one that geopolitical analysts or financial commentators can answer. It is one that citizens, voters, and the eaters they choose, will determine. And that is why understanding what is happening, truly understanding it at the level of depth and detail that this video has attempted to provide, matters so much. An informed citizenry that understands the stakes can demand the strategic seriousness that the moment requires. A citizenry that does not understand what is happening cannot demand what it cannot see. The geography of the Beijing-Riyadh axis is ultimately the geography of a choice that the world is being asked to make without ever being formally asked. A choice between a managed, negotiated transition to a new multipolar monetary order and an unmanaged, competitive, potentially catastrophic collision between old power and new ambition. History gives us reason for both hope and fear about which outcome prevails. What it does not give us is the luxury of ignorance. The decisions being made right now in the gleaming towers of Riyadh and the conference rooms of Zhongnanhai are decisions that will shape the economic reality of every person on this planet for generations to come. The least we can do is understand them clearly. The most we can do is demand that our leaders respond to them wisely. Think about what it means for the next generation of Americans, Europeans, and citizens of every Western democracy that has built its prosperity onto the invisible subsidy of dollar dominance. The social contracts of these societies, the pension systems, the public health care, the infrastructure programs, the defense commitments, were all priced in a world where America could borrow cheaply because the world had no choice but to hold dollars. If that structural advantage erodes meaningfully over the coming decade, the fiscal arithmetic of every Western government becomes dramatically more difficult. The choices become harder, the political tensions become more acute, and the temptation to respond to economic pressure with geopolitical aggression, historically the most dangerous moment in any declining hegemon's trajectory, becomes more acute as well. This is why the Beijing-Riyadh axis is not just an economic story or a geopolitical story. It is ultimately a story about the condition is for peace and stability in a world that is rapidly becoming more complex, more multipolar, and more dangerously difficult to manage than any previous era in modern history. Understanding it is not optional for anyone who cares about the world their children will inherit. That is the story of the Beijing-Riyadh axis. That is the geography of the new world being built around us. And now, you know exactly where it is being drawn, but of which. Why it matters, and what comes next. If this video gave you the clarity that the mainstream media has consistently failed to provide, hit subscribe. Share this with someone who needs to understand what is actually happening at the foundations of global power, and leave a comment below telling us what part of the yes story shocked you the most. Because the more people who truly understand this transition, the better the chance that the world navigates it without catastrophe. We will see you in the next one.